the only man alive who knows how to play the Game of Thrones and win. George R.R. Martin is the best-selling author in the English language right now, with over 15 million books sold worldwide.
He's a great prose writer. I mean, his prose is incredibly vivid, incredibly gripping.
The most famous of which is his epic Story of Ice and Fire series, better known these days as Game of Thrones.
Ultimately, it's real-world drama, but in a fantasy setting.
It's almost a medieval soap opera.
Love, hate, jealousy, rivalry, political intrigue, family conflict.
Today, it's a global TV phenomenon, and we are all playing the game now. But whose side are you on? My name's Grace Dent, and last week I was lucky enough to meet the great man himself and get an exclusive insight into what makes him tick. George, you've opened up this genre of fantasy that I would have never have looked at before. So I wanted to thank you for that. And I also wanted to say thank you for creating, in my opinion, one of the strongest pieces of television the last few years.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And I'm gonna leave my fangirl behind now and try to be completely professional from now on.
Sounds good.
Can you tell me just a little bit about your childhood?
Sure. I was born in 1948 in Bayonne, New Jersey, which is a blue-collar industrial town. My father was a longshoreman. We never had much money, so we never went anywhere. We did not even own a car. I lived in a world that was 5 blocks long. My school was on 5th Street. I lived on 1st Street. From the projects where I lived, I could see these huge tankers flying all the flags of the world. I had a big book of flags that I would look at, and I'd watch the ships go by and wonder what countries they came from, and I'd look up and say, well, that one's from Norway, and that one's from South Africa, or whatever, and dream about being on those ships. And then I found books. And in books, I could go to Mars. I could go to King Arthur's court. I could hunt through Sherwood Forest with Robin Hood. I could fight Martians with H.G. Wells. And, you know, it opened worlds for me, enabled me to live life. And I think that's what fantasy does. I've always made up stories. I found notebooks that I had since I was a kid where I'm writing, you know, I can't be more than 5 or 6. I'm drawing pictures of the planets and writing Mars and then descriptions of all the people who live on Mars and made up planets, you know. I didn't know the distinction between Mars on one hand and Zumba on the other.
So from the age of 5, it was fantasy fiction you were writing?
Fantasy, science fiction, and horror, which I called monster stories.
Who in the literary world were you influenced by or simply in awe of?
When I was quite young, my big literary influence was comic books.
Okay.
I mean, I read all the comic books of the time. Superman and Batman and the superhero comics were my favorites.
Aged 16, you pulled off an amazing coup and had a letter in Marvel.
I think I had a number of letters in Marvel. The first one was in Fantastic Four, and it was about Stan Lee and was better than Shakespeare. Marvel published all of my letters, but it led to stuff, because in those days when they printed your letter, they printed your full address underneath it. So other comic book fans began to send me letters, and they began to send me fanzines. And a lot of them were produced by high school kids, which is what I was at the time. And I started subscribing to some, and then I started writing for some. I wrote some articles, some critical articles, saying about what comics I liked and what I didn't like and what was wrong with the bad ones. And then I started writing some fiction, because they also published fiction. And that was the big breakthrough.
How did it feel?
It felt great. Other people started sending in letters saying how much they liked it.
Yeah.
You know, the ego boo, as they called it, ego boosting. That made me feel tremendous.
After comics came numerous short stories and even the odd novel. And by the end of the 70s, George was well on his way to becoming a full-time writer. But then Hollywood came calling. Suddenly, you've gone from working alone on these beautifully crafted pieces that are your baby to going into a television world where it's lots of people and lots of egos. How did you find that?
Writing novels is very lonely work. I mean, it's essentially just you and, in those days, a typewriter and a blank sheet of paper. So I actually liked working with other people, and I loved seeing my stories assume tangible reality. You know, the first time one of my scripts was actually filmed was Adaptation for Twilight Zone, sort of an otherworldly version of Stonehenge. And when I actually saw carpenters building Stonehenge on the soundstage behind my office, it was an amazing feeling. It was these things that I'd made up are actually growing. People are actually putting them together, and here are actors coming in and actually saying my words. But there's the dark side, and you have the network and the studio, these two Darth Vader forces that periodically reach down and mess with your scripts or your shows or do things, seldom in a positive manner, and that's frustrating. On the third hand, there are large dump trucks full of money.
After a decade writing scripts on hit TV shows like Beauty and the Beast, George was now a big shot writer-producer until one day in 1991, he had an idea. Did you set out to write an epic saga? I heard a wonderful quote from you where you said, "I knew that all was lost when I began to sketch a map."
In the summer of '91, I had no current Hollywood assignments. And then one day, from I don't know where, I suddenly thought of this scene where these wolf pups are discovered with their dead mother by some medieval type people riding through the summer snows. I knew they were summer snows. Somehow that phrase was very important to me. And it just came to me so vividly that I had to write it.
It's a freak. It's a dire wolf.
I wrote that chapter. It only took me about 3 days. And by the time I was finished, I knew what the chapter after that had to be, and then the chapter after that. I wound up spending the rest of that summer working on what would eventually be Game of Thrones. And indeed, somewhere in there, I did indeed stop and draw the map, which was the point where I said, okay, I know what this is now. This is a fantasy novel, and I need to design the world that it goes in, like Tolkien's Middle-earth, and come up with a name for it, and come up with a genealogy.
Logistically, how do you keep track of everything that's going? I mean, I love to think you've just got maps and everything's mapped out on walls, or is it really just in your mind?
I remember these things that I make up better than I remember real people or events. I remember some obscure character who appeared 3 novels ago in one paragraph, but I don't remember someone I met yesterday. I bump into them the following day in another context, and I don't know who they are. So obviously the brain neurons that other people use to deal with real life in my brain are wired differently.
So is George R.R. the new J.R.R.? Tolkien, that is.
Tolkien's characters, as much as they're beloved, everyone loves Strider and Gandalf, they don't quite have that flawed realism that the characters who inhabit Martin's world do.
I really like Martin's work, and I'd set it aside from Tolkien's work and say it's his own classic.
I much prefer him to Tolkien.
I would say he's better than Tolkien, yeah.
I find Tolkien a bit humorless.
I don't think it's a matter of me replacing him or overtaking him or anything like that. If my work is being read 50 years from now as Tolkien's work is being read, I'll be thrilled.
The remarkable thing for me was this is a genre that I'd not looked at before, and I wasn't expecting to find these characters that I can really identify with. And I was seeing, these are people from a world that don't really exist, but they're having the same kind of problems that I do.
Yeah, I've always felt that character is the heart of fiction. If you make the characters real, then the rest of the furniture around them is almost incidental. You'll still have a powerful story. You'll still have a story that will involve and affect your readers. So for me, character is really what fiction is all about.
With the characters in Game of Thrones, they're very three-dimensional, that you get to know all their characteristics.
They're people you would sit next to at dinner. They're not worried about retrieving a magic amulet from somewhere. They're worried about who's going to kill them or whether they're going to get to eat next week or who they're going to have sex with next.
He's certainly an incredible master of plot and of character. I think throughout this immense series of novels, you get constant shifts and developments in character, which is the mark of a really, really good writer.
Away with you, dog. You're scaring my lady. Don't like to see you upset.
You're a very accessible author.
Yes, which has good and bad to it, I tell you. It just never dawned on me to erect all these protective walls about myself.
When you go to the conventions and to the book signings, do you still just feel like a fanboy yourself, going and looking at the merchandise and meeting people that are like you, or do you feel like you've moved to another plane now?
I can remember book signings back in the 80s, and where no one would come. Obviously, those days have gone, and I saw with each volume of Ice and Fire, the crowds have gotten bigger. And with Feast for Crows and with Dance with Dragons, the last two books, the crowds have been enormous.
But the fans were about to go even crazier when HBO announced it was adapting the first book. In fact, we all went stark raving mad for Game of Thrones. See you after the break. Welcome back to my exclusive chat with the genius behind Game of Thrones, Mr. George R.R. Martin. In July 2010, filming started in Northern Ireland on the first book in Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series. Fans everywhere held their breath.
When I heard they were turning it into a TV show, I was initially apprehensive. Then I found out it was HBO. I thought, if anyone can do it, it's going to be them.
I was very nervous, but then when I saw the casting and I started watching it, I was so excited.
Described by some as The Sopranos and Middle-earth, the budget for the first series was a mind-blowing $60 million.
If you read the books, it's almost as if they were written with an HBO series in mind. You follow one character and their interests for a given moment, then you flash to the next one, scene by scene by scene by scene.
For years, the television landscape has been awash with cop shows and medical dramas. But I think fantasy, and particularly fantasy on this scale, it's something brand new, and I think that's why it's captured people's imaginations.
I think your ability to create strong, complex women is quite remarkable. Cersei Lannister, I love her. She's the first person I've ever become attached to who's in an incestuous relationship with her brother. And it's an incestuous relationship that I root for because I actually think that they're a great couple.
The boy won't talk. And if he does, I'll kill him. Him, Ned Stark, the king, the whole bloody lot of them, until you and I are the only people left in this world.
When you read a book or see a TV show, if you got the hero and you have the villain, one is black and one is white, and everybody responds to them the same way, oh, we like the hero, we hiss at the villain, then you're dealing with cardboard. If the characters are fully fleshed and complicated, then people are going to react to them differently, just as if they were real people. People watching the TV show are going to tend to like Cersei more than people who are just reading the books. And that's due to the brilliance of Lena Headey and her wonderful performance as Cersei. She's giving her a dimension of humanity and explaining her motivations and wonderfully nuanced performance.
She loves her children.
She does.
She loves her children. That's her redeeming feature, that and her cheekbones.
Do I have to marry her?
Yes. She's very beautiful and young. And if you don't like her, you only need to see her on formal occasions and when the time comes to make little princes and princesses. And if you'd rather fuck painted whores, you'll fuck painted whores.
Can I talk to you about Joffrey? I have never been so moved and aggravated by a baddie on television in my entire life. He's unsettling and hateable on so many different levels. So you've got this tiny psychopath born of incest with a tendency for woman beating and sexually perverted malice. And worse, probably in my opinion, than all of this, he was responsible for the death of one of the direwolves in the first series. My theory, is he somebody that you went to school with?
You know, there might be something to that. I think he's about 5 or 6 people that I went to school with.
Leave her face. I like her pretty.
Joffrey is a classic bully in many ways, and he's very full of himself, and he's incredibly spoiled. I mean, he was raised without limits, and he's got 2 fathers, neither of which has ever really given him much of what you would call fatherly attention or discipline. I think in some senses he's still trying to impress his fathers. We're being very fortunate in our actor. I mean, Jack Gleason, who is, by the way, the nicest kid in the world, and he's terrific, and he's doing such an amazing job that I think people are threatening him on the street and wanting to come up and slap him. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets assaulted somehow.
Your girl and that butcher's boy attacked my son. That animal of hers nearly tore his arm off.
That's not true. She just bit him a little. He was hurting Micah.
A big favourite of people that I speak to is Arya, the little girl rejecting all the conventions of her sex to become this young warrior.
She was one of my favorites right from the beginning. I mean, people often ask me who's my favorite character, and my answer is always Tyrion, but Arya is probably the second favorite, and it's pretty close. She's always a joy to write. Maisie Williams, what a find she was. We looked through hundreds of girls for Arya, and she's become a real favorite in the TV show.
Game of Thrones is absolutely full of sex, and I'd like to thank you for that because I enjoy that very much.
Oh, good. Well, you're welcome.
Why?
Well, life is very full of sex, or should be. You know, I'm as much as I admire Tolkien, and I do. He was a giant of fantasy and a giant of literature, and I think he wrote a great book that will be read for many years. But you do have to wonder where all those hobbits came from, since you can't imagine hobbits having sex, can you? Well, sex is an important part of who we are. It drives us, it motivates us, it makes us do sometimes very noble things. It makes us do sometimes incredibly stupid things. Leave it out and you've got an incomplete world. I get letters regularly from people who say, oh, I loved your books until I hit the pornography, and now I will never read them again because you're just a dirty pornographer. I write back to some of them and I say, I'm sorry you feel that way. You know, you can skip over those scenes if you want, but although some of them are important for revealing things about character or revealing plot points, what I never get any complaints about, of course, is the violence. And this is uniquely American here, that I can describe in exquisite detail an axe entering a man's skull and splattering blood and brains. Not a peep. I describe a penis entering a vagina in equivalent detail. The world has ended.
But the sex isn't just on screen in Game of Thrones, especially for fans of the Dothraki Khaleesi, Daenerys Targaryen.
I'm actually having a number of people naming their children Daenerys. They send me pictures of their babies and sometimes bring them to my signings. 3 or 4 years from now, the first wave of Daeneryses will be hitting kindergarten and grammar school. I wonder what the teachers are going to make of this. They're going to have a hard time spelling the name with all those A's and E's and Y's and things like that.
I am the dragon's daughter, and I swear to you that those who would harm you will die screaming.
Knowing how passionate the fans are, you still fearlessly kill off people's favourite characters. The beheading of Ned Stark in the first series was such a shock to viewers. Is this something you do lightly? Do you write that line in the book and then go downstairs and simply have a cup of coffee?
No, it's never easy.
Bring me his head.
When it happened in the book, you know, a few reviewers made note of it. Oh, there's a shocking development at the end. You know, Martin's not afraid to kill his characters, etc. But it was no big thing. It was a little ripple. When it happened in a TV show, it was like a bomb had exploded on the internet, went crazy, and YouTube went crazy, and the emails started pouring in to the show and to HBO, and lots of reviews were, oh my God, no one has ever done this sort of thing before, et cetera, et cetera. If you're going to write a story about war and intrigue and death and all that, you have to establish to your readers or your viewers that you're playing for real, that these people were in actual danger.
Look at him!
As the books go on, you can never predict who's going to stay alive and who's going to die, and I think that's the most important. It's completely real. You couldn't predict the ending at all.
I don't know where he's going. I'd love to, I'd love to meet him and ask him what his plans are for the future.
Do you know how the Ice and Fire series is going to end?
I do, in broad strokes. I know the ending. I know the fates of the principal characters. Maybe not all the secondary and tertiary characters, but certainly the main players. I've known that, for a long time ago.
With at least 2 more books still to be written and a 3rd TV series currently in production, this Game of Thrones is far from over. In fact, it's hardly even begun.
George, it's been an absolute thrill to have you here today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.